You don't
Great,
even have to
great.
move it all.
Pero para que nos vean, ¿son todos ustedes bilingües? ¿Sí? No importa el idioma.
Spanglish is the official language of
Okay,
America.
okay, okay. So this is Gary Orfield, and I'm Patricia Gándara, and we are co-directors of the Civil Rights Project, Proyecto de Derechos Civiles at UCLA. Gary founded the project at Harvard University, where it lived for casi 10 años, ¿verdad? And then we brought it about 8 years ago to UCLA. And he can tell you great things, longs about it, but I don't want to spend too much time. But we engage in a whole lot of research having to do with civil rights. And we've recently been involved in a very serious, big Supreme Court case, but that's kind of normal for the stuff that we do. Gary?
Yeah, let me just say a little bit more about myself and then go into the subject. I'm a political scientist, but I have been multidisciplinary all my life. And at UCLA, I have appointments in political science, law, education, and urban planning. And that kind of expresses my interest. I am very interested in trying to understand the conditions that produce racial inequality in the United States and the conditions under which it can be remedied. And we are actively involved not only in research, but actively in policy. So we just submitted a brief to the United States Supreme Court last week that 800 scholars from 46 states signed about the necessity of affirmative action, because the Supreme Court will be considering whether or not to end it in December. And it's probable that they will decide to end it for the whole country.
And how many of you know what is meant by affirmative action? Acción afirmativa.
Affirmative action is the policy by which students of color in the United States are given some special attention in terms of admissions to college and employment in other fields. Almost all of the most selective colleges in the United States have had this policy since the 1960s, except in the states where it's forbidden. California is one of the states where it has been forbidden by a public vote in 1996, 19 years ago. And one of the studies that we commissioned for this document for the Supreme Court was a document that Patricia and a colleague wrote on why all of the efforts of hundreds of millions of dollars, efforts by the University of California, have failed to achieve much diversity in the last 19 years since affirmative action was forbidden. 43 states still have affirmative action, and it may be forbidden everywhere in public and private institutions if the Supreme Court decides to do that in response to the Texas case that we have now. That's just one illustration of the kinds of issues that we're involved in. We like to do research that makes a difference. We like to do research that surfaces things that people in power might not want to know about and challenges them to address them as strongly as possible. And we are perfectly willing to use the avenues of legal lawsuits and enforcement activities and so forth whenever we can, and we do get involved in them. We don't.
So for that reason, you guys, we are so excited about this project that you are going to be participating in. I just want you to know that both Gary and I have pretty long careers, and this is one of the most exciting projects we've ever been associated with. It is going to be groundbreaking. It is going to be like nothing else that has been done before. Cross the border, looking at young people and how they are growing and developing and what they're thinking about and what kinds of resources exist out there for them across 2 countries in an extremely dynamic, economically dynamic area. So this is a super exciting project.
So you will be doing surveys on both sides of the border here in the Tijuana, San Diego area. But there will also be a big study going on that's basically a big statistical study of the whole region of Southern California and Northern Baja. Because this is an area of continuous urbanization. We look at this area between the northern suburbs of Los Angeles and the southern suburbs of Tijuana as one great city. city that's 150 miles long. It has 24 million people in it. And it is the great megalopolis of the Western Pacific. This is the greatest urban complex on the west of the Pacific Ocean. And it is a very important area of interaction between the two countries, the most active border in the world. And it's also an area of tremendous economic power. It's an area that shapes a significant part of the gross national product of the United States, and important in Mexico too. But it's an area that's very far from both capitals. Very few people in Washington and very few people in Mexico City have any idea what's going on in this region. And we're going to try to put the statistics together so they have to think about it. So we've been trying to, first of all, figure out what's been going on in Southern California, which is the 6 counties that begin with Ventura County going through San Diego County. There's 6 urbanized counties of Southern California, an area of some 22 million people. They are all going through a radical racial and economic change. And it is on both sides of the border, basically people of Mexican origin that will determine the future. But in the California case, it's a huge transformation because California in the middle of the 20th century was an extremely white area, over 90% white in its population. And the image of California was blonde girls on the beach. You know, the immigrants to California were from states in the middle and the south of the United States, from the Midwest and from places like Texas and other southern states. Those were the immigrants to California in that period. This was the huge Western movement that really dominated much of the 20th century. After the immigration reforms in 1965, the country really began to change dramatically because up until that time, there'd been very slow immigration from Mexico. The percentage of Latinos in American schools in the late 1960s was only 5%. It's now about 25%. It's changed enormously. In California at that time, it was an overwhelmingly white population, overwhelmingly middle class, and it was viewed as kind of the paradise of America. After that time, almost all the growth came from international immigration. It's the first international immigration in American history that's predominantly non-white. A vast immigration from Latin America and from Asia, both centered on California, on Southern California especially. So we went through this extremely dramatic change, and we really haven't developed policies that came to terms with it. In fact, the two presidents that came from Southern California, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, were actively opposed to minority rights and really did diminish minority rights very substantially during their terms of office. On the other hand, the greatest Supreme Court justice that opened up opportunity was also Californian. Earl Warren was his name, and came from, his family were immigrants from Norway. Where my family were too. So what we're thinking about is trying to explain to you the transformation that goes on in this process. We have had a huge immigration in Southern California from Mexico and Central America. And it's pretty much over at the time. We're not having any net immigration now. Now we're actually having more immigration from Asia because of the extremely coercive
Repressive.
closing of the border and redirection of the traffic across the border from California to Arizona and other places. We are seeing, though, the vast majority of the Latinos in California are born in California. They're not immigrants.
But they're the children of immigrants.
They're children of immigrants, and many times children with at least one undocumented parent, many of whom have their lives disrupted by living part-time on both sides of the border. We think neither country really does a good job in serving these kids. So if you think about Southern California, the wealth of California is near the ocean, and it's in the four counties, Los Angeles, Orange County, San Diego, Ventura. These are places that have all been historically very white, and now they are all changing quite dramatically and rapidly. So we see places, and it's going very far from the coast inland into the desert areas of California, and San Bernardino and Riverside counties particularly, which are called the Inland Empire. These areas have become, these are the only areas with affordable housing in Southern California, and they have become more and more Latino and significantly African American. There's also major immigration going from China into this area, as Chinese families try to find a home and a way to have children in the U.S. Today, what we've seen is that the children in Southern California have very unequal schools. There's an extremely high level of segregation by race and by poverty, and sometimes by language, which we call triple segregation. So if you look at Southern California, in 1970, the typical Latino student was in a school that had a majority of whites and was a majority middle-class school. They're now in a school that's 84% non-white and overwhelmingly poor, more than 2/3 of the children living in poverty. These schools
And
are
overwhelmingly Latino, as turns
Yes,
out to be the case.
exactly. And these schools are very systematically unequal in every important respect.
And I'll talk more about that.
The children, Professor Gándara will tell you more about that, but they are unequal in terms of not only what the school does, but what the families can provide, how stable the residential patterns are, many other factors that health inequalities, and many things that shape educational opportunity. Anyway, so there's been a vast increase in segregation. There's a tremendously unequal level of educational attainment by race in Southern California.
And I'll show stuff.
Yeah, Asians are by far the highest achievers, followed by whites, followed by Latinos and African Americans, depending on which measure you're looking at. One or the other may be on top. But in terms of college access, there's a very, very scary story. We think that in both sides of the border, the Latino young people are not getting the amount of education that's necessary for long-term entry into the middle class in either country. And that we have a huge social crisis that comes out of that. There's a vast difference in income by education levels in this region. And the jobs that are being created are jobs that require post-secondary education. And when we had the Great Recession in the middle of the last decade, there was a tremendous wipeout of wealth and job employment for people with less high school education or less. We're a society where people with secondary education have had declining real incomes now for 30 years. You have to have post-secondary education to have an increase in actual income. And the probability of unemployment relates very directly to your educational level. Latinos in Southern California, especially Latino men, were very concentrated in the construction industry, which has a lot of pretty good paying jobs, but really collapsed during the Great Recession. So there was a huge decline. Now what we're also seeing demographically in Southern California and in Baja is a tremendous decline in the fertility rates. In other words, families have gotten much smaller. On both sides of the border, the average family is now below the reproduction level. So that means we're not having enough children to maintain a constant population, unless we have immigration.
Think about that for a minute,
Yeah.
okay? Everybody wants to shut down the border, but it actually puts the economy at risk.
But the population growth in Mexico has also gone down very dramatically. It's well below the reproduction level. So both countries are going to be having, if these trends continue, a shortage of entry-level workers, especially entry-level workers who are educated sufficiently for the jobs that we have. From the US side, a very serious possibility that we will have in this generation a lower average educational level than we had in the last generation for the first time in the history of the United States. Basically because we're not educating the immigrants who came here. They're not getting the level of education of the workers that they're replacing in the labor force. This is a devastating trend for the United States, and of course for any country. The US was the highest college completion in the world for many years. It's now ranks 15th or 16th. Many other countries are going ahead of us, the main countries that we compete with. So if we think about this, we're thinking about a huge population of young people who aren't getting what they need, an economy that's not getting what it needs, a lot of deep racial polarization and separation related to unequal opportunity, and nobody really addressing it with any real power. And what we want to do is we want to put together this story so that we can talk about the entire region, because of course the statistical base of data in Mexico is different than here in the US. So we have a young woman who's done some high-level policy research in the DF in Mexico, who's working with us, with a person who's done a lot of the demographic and economic analysis in our project on the US side. And we're trying to put these pieces together so we can talk about the whole region as a region. It's a region that is very organically connected in terms of environment, in terms of culture, in terms of many things, but also has this huge wall between it. And also has the most rapid crossing of that wall, legal and not as much illegal anymore, because that movement, that river has changed to the east. But it's an extraordinarily dynamic, interesting area of great importance to both countries that neither capital really knows enough about, and that we're in a position to tell them really important things that will have great consequences for the economic and social viability of a major part of the US and an important part of Mexico.
So we expect that in a decade, you guys will be talking about that project that we worked on that now is being talked about everywhere, and maybe you will come back around to and you will work on it, continue working on it. But you hand me the book.
Sure.
This one. So,
Well, they may be running agencies
yeah.
that are doing something.
This may actually change the way you think about a lot of things. But so my family is from Jalisco, from Guadalajara, and I have kind of lived this story myself because my own brother was educated almost entirely in Mexico, then came to the US y fracasó because the schools had nothing to offer him, even though he was well educated in Mexico. And this is the kind of thing, and now in a very ironic way, my prima, my cousin, is in charge of accepting the students who come from Mexico into the Department of Education in Jalisco. And she tries to figure out how to make...
From the US.
I'm sorry? Students from the US, yeah, coming back to Jalisco. And she tries to figure out how to incorporate these students back into the schools. So, so in many ways, over my lifetime, I've sort of lived this kind of back and forth and had this view. So this is very personal to me, as well as being, you know, an academic thing that's that I think can be really powerful. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what we know about education of Latino students, since basically, as Gary pointed out, we're talking about a Mexican origin population on both sides of the border. This is mostly who we are educating and not educating.
Southern California has more than 3/4 students of color. In other words, whites account for less than 1/4 of the public school students in Southern California.
About 25%.
That's all the way from the northern suburbs of Los Angeles to the border.
Yeah, so this has changed. If any of you get more interested in this topic, you know, I'll actually leave this, Melissa, for the, so this is a book we published years ago called The Latino Education Crisis, and why all of this matters so terribly much to all of our futures. What happens in this region, what happens with the education of Latino students. So, what I want to do is I want to show you some statistics about where things stand right now, and then talk about a little bit about why we think things are going this way, and then talk a little bit about what are the repercussions of all of this? What are the consequences? What can we expect? And I know that Gary will jump in at any point. We teach classes together, so we're pretty used to going back and forth. So just looking at California and the latest data that we have about graduation rates, okay, high school graduation rates in California, you can see that the highest graduation rates are for Asian students. About 92% of them will graduate on time from high school. After that is white students. About 88% of them will graduate on time after 4 years. And Latino students, while this, I have to tell you, is significantly better than it has been in the past, because a few years ago we were looking at like 60%, we're now up to a roaring almost 77%, which is great progress, but it also, you can see there's a significant gap between them and the white and Asian students in the state. And then African Americans are even below that.
One of the things that's important for you to know is that the students who are coming from Asia, except for the ones who came around the Vietnam War.
I'm going to show this.
Oh, okay. Are from a different social class.
Yeah, I'm going to show you something, because I think this really is an important point. You see, we think alike on this.
Yeah.
Now, the
Right.
African Americans are not doing as well as Latinos, and that's bad, and that's really bad. But it's not as acute as it is for Latinos, because African Americans are only about 6.5% of the school population, whereas Latinos are now over half. We're just edging up to 54% of all of the children in the state of California are Latino. So, you know, if you listen to what Gary was saying about what it was like at mid-century here in California, and who graduated then and who graduates now, and you look at what the population dynamics are in our schools, and that gap, that has tremendous consequences for this state and for this region. Big gaps in who's in our schools and who's successfully graduating.
Patricia, where's this data coming from? Because we've been trying to teach sort of how to think about analyzing data. So if you could sort of explain where the source is.
Okay, almost all the stuff, yeah, it's kind of hard to do that on overheads, but I can also send all this stuff to you too. But basically these numbers come straight out of the, you can write this down. So cde.ca.gov. There's a thing called DataQuest. If you do cde.ca.gov, you'll come to the State California Department of Education website, and you will see that there's a DataQuest piece on there, and you can go into that and you can ask all kinds of questions of it, and it comes up right like that.
And the numbers I was talking about come from a number of sources, including the Common Core of Data of the National Center for Education Statistics, which is part of the Federal Education Department, the American Community Survey of the United States Census, which is called at census.gov, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from a number of different agencies and data sources. There's a vast amount of data available.
You know, there's another website, and actually these statistics, unlike most, well, virtually everything else I'm going to show you, these actually come from a website, and this is the Campaign for College Opportunity. So write that down. They do a lot of data analysis. In fact, they quote us in big red letters about the study that we did, in which we reported that only 9% of Latinos are in the top 20% of high schools. But they do a lot of data analysis, and they have a report in 2014 on Latinos, the education of Latinos in California, because they're very concerned about access to higher education. So what this tells you about, and in the translation from a Mac to a regular, everything doesn't come out exactly right, but A through G, for those of you who, some of you know this very, very well, and others of you probably don't, but in California, you have to have a certain set of courses that you must take if you take and pass with at least a B grade in order to get into any of the public four-year colleges in the state. So whether it's UCSD or whether it's San Diego State or any of the public four-year colleges, you have to have taken these courses and passed them at a reasonable level. Only 29% of Latinos, more than 2/3, okay, well, only 29% of Latinos have actually, in 2013, which was the last time for which we had these data, taken and passed those courses. So that means that only 29% of Latinos first we got that graduation problem, right? Okay, now we get them graduated, but beyond graduation, you have to have taken these courses if you're going to get into college. And only 29% of those 76% who graduated have actually even taken the courses and passed them in order to be eligible. Now that doesn't say they're going to a four-year college, but that says that's the pool from which we can actually pull students out and get them into our four-year colleges. That compares to 2/3 of Asian students, almost half of white students, and virtually the same for African American students.
They go to very different kinds of high schools.
Well, yeah. Okay, now this is looking at the United States as a whole, so that you have some context for this. In the US as a whole, the last time for which we have these data, the 25 to 29-year-olds, so most people who are going to get a college degree have completed it by age 29. There will be a few more who go on to do that afterwards, particularly among Latinos, by the way, who stretch out the longest. But by 29 years old, most people have gotten this degree if they're going to do it. And at that point, 60% of Asian students have a BA degree or higher. 40% of white students have a BA degree or higher. Even 20% of African American students have a BA or higher. And 15% nationally of Latinos have a BA or higher. Does that give you some sense about how competitive the Latino population is, basically for those jobs that are opening up in the area that are going to require some level of college education?
This is the percent that has a reasonable shot at middle-class life.
It's a disaster. But it gets worse. So here, because there would have been too many lines, I've done this in a different format. In California, the situation is even worse. In 2013, the Department of Education reports that, it comes out to be about 9% of Latinos in the state get a degree. 10.5% of females, 7.5% of Latino males. So now we're looking, when we split it out by gender, the Latino males in the state of California rarely get a BA degree or higher.
And this is directly related to the probability of marriage. You know, the average Latino child in the U.S. is now born with an unmarried mother. And one of the reasons is there are not that many economically qualified males in the communities.
And actually, if you look at this, you can see that males in every ethnic group are doing more poorly than females. But nobody, even African Americans, Latinos are getting half as many degrees in California as African Americans are. And then the gap gets wider and wider from there. Look, for Asian females, it's almost 5 times as it is for Latinas. So the population is simply not competitive for the jobs that will be out there that will lead to anything like a middle-class life. And what we have is we have a lot of undereducated people scrambling for the jobs at the bottom, which keeps the salaries or keeps the hourly wage very low, because you've got all of these people who want and need these jobs. So an important statistic.
Another thing that is important is that there's very little unionization now in the U.S. economy.
Yeah.
And and they could there's a lot of unionization, but
It doesn't work for the
doesn't
worker.
work very well.
Yeah.
So these workers have to take whatever they can get. They have very little bargaining power.
Yeah, that's another great topic, you guys, for another day, is unionization and what the impact of that is on wages and on welfare of workers. But I'm going to move on now to a little bit of a comparison between Mexico and the United States, because this has tremendous implications for this region in particular. The average education level in Mexico is 8.6 years, just short of completing secundaria. Okay, so just short of a 9th grade completion rate. In the United States, the average education level is about a year and a half higher beyond high school. So this is average, okay? This is across the board averages. But what this is saying to us is that we have a population that will move back and forth. We have a Mexican population that will move into the US, but the average level of education of these individuals is vastly lower than the native born here in the US. And the expectations, I want to talk a little bit more about why this is, but the expectations that the typical working class Mexican individual has about what is an appropriate or an expected level of education is very different than what it is in the US, where even though we have a lot of kids who fall through the cracks, there's still a certain societal expectation that you will at least finish high school. And that's because we have compulsory laws that say you're supposed to be in school until you finish the 12th grade. But in this region, we have this mix of individuals with very different expectations about what is an appropriate level of education. Okay, so why do we have this disastrous situation? 1/3 of Latino and Latino students live in poverty. And what we call poverty in the US is like misery compared to what the rest of the developed world considers poverty. So to give you an example, last year, if your family made less than about $24,000 a year or less, and you were in a family of 4, that was poverty.
That was up. You were out of poverty. You made that much.
If you, no, I said if you're less, $24,000 or less, you were living in poverty. But 2/3 of immigrant Latinos are living at or near poverty. So if this is the group that is coming into the US as immigrants, those individuals overwhelmingly are living at an extremely low level in the society. I mean, you guys living here in San Diego have some idea how much rent are you paying even as students, right? If you're living here, how much is the rent? Think about trying to support a family of 4 and paying the rent on a 1-bedroom apartment. Latinos begin school significantly behind others, and this is directly related to poverty. It's also related to residential movement, and it's related very, very strongly to the parents' level of education. But so when our Latino students begin school on the very first day of kindergarten, they are significantly behind other children with respect to their readiness for school, their knowledge of letters, or of numbers, of quantity. I mean, these basic readiness skills are not as developed because of poverty and because of low levels of access to reasonable education. They are the least likely of all groups to have been to preschool. So they're coming out of poverty, they're going into kindergarten, and if they're the children of immigrants, they're going into kindergarten without well-developed English, and they're going to be teaching them in English and testing them in English, and yet they've had no preparation for this. As Gary mentioned, these young people are increasingly isolated in segregated schools and neighborhoods where they have very little contact with the mainstream. So there's not even a conception about what the expectations are out there in the middle class, what it is that middle class people are doing to raise their kids, to get them competitive, to do well in school and go on. No conception, because these young people are growing up in neighborhoods where they never hear any of this. Nobody ever talks about this, right? And the parents have exceptionally low education levels and almost no contact with U.S. schools. So consider that if it's an immigrant family, the parents don't know anything about what it's like to go to school in the U.S. or what's expected of you as a parent to support the schools. They know nothing about this because they've had no personal experience with it.
And a lot of these parents are in what we would call the contingent labor force, where they don't have a regular work schedule, where they are told they have to come in certain hours the day before, and where they don't have a guaranteed number of hours of work per week. And it's very, very difficult if you're a single parent and you have that kind of a job to be able to take care of your children adequately.
And millions of families, of Latino families, have an undocumented member, which can cause enormous stress on students. The figure is thrown around that we have about 11 million undocumented folks in the country, but that's just the individual himself or herself. That doesn't take into account the radiating effect of having one member of the family who's undocumented, which can put the entire family at risk and can mean that from one day to the next, you're gone. So we know that we have so many young people in our schools, and particularly in this region, who can't even think about what is going on in the classroom because they don't know if when they get home that afternoon, their family's still going to be there.
We just had a decision this week by the United States Court of Appeals, the highest court before the Supreme Court, that overturned President Obama's DACA effort.
DAPA.
DAPA, yeah.
The DAPA.
If that decision is upheld, the capacity of the president to do anything to help these students will be eliminated.
And of course that was,
next election.
yeah, and that was the rationale behind this whole policy that he tried to get across, is that this would help these kids who sit in a classroom and wonder, are my parents going to be there when I get home this afternoon? That's who would have been protected by this, but who no longer are, well, they never were protected, but we just lost at least an immediate chance. And now the Obama administration is trying to take this to the Supreme Court, which worries everybody, because the Supreme Court has never been very supportive of immigrants, and this Supreme Court has not been.
Republicans in Congress have said they will not pass any immigration reforms until we have a new president.
Yeah.
So we are in a very difficult position.
So consider that when we're out there in the field and we're surveying kids, we're looking at the kids who are living on this side of the border and living on the other side of the border, many of whom are retornados, right? Many of whom have gone back after having lived for some time here in this area. This issue of undocumented status, sometimes in families that have been here for 20 years, 25 years, they've established a whole life. They're integral to the places where they work. Oftentimes these businesses or people that employ them are depending on these folks. The kids in our schools that we're seeing are living with this incredible weight over them day after day.
And our purpose in our project is to find out things that really do make a difference. And we have, in research that we've done, found out things that have changed court decisions, changed policies. So that will be the ultimate goal.
That will be our goal here.
After we find out what the story is and explain it to the world, it's what best we can.
So Gary started to mention this to you, and I told him, shh, because I have the data here. And the reason I want you guys to see this is because out there in the world, perhaps not here in this room, and not among the people that we know, but out there in the world, there is a constant chatter about, well, the reason that those Mexican kids don't do well is because they come from a culture that does not believe in education, doesn't value education. And the reason that the Asian kids do so well is because they come from a culture that really values education. And so this is really all about culture. Well, this slide is to tell you it is not about culture. This slide is to tell you it's about opportunity. So look at what I've shown you here is two Latino groups, those who come from Mexico and those who come from South America, and two Asian groups, those who come from Taiwan and those who come from Cambodia. I want you to know that the individuals that come from Mexico and those who come from Cambodia, if you, any kind of test you want to give them, they look very, very similar. I mean, they score about the same on any kind of test, whether it's a college entrance test or the state tests or anything else, because their experience is very similar. 2/3 of their families are living below or near poverty. Mothers with a BA degree, 3% of Mexican mothers who are the mothers of our children of immigrants here in the U.S. have a college degree, 3%. 4% of Cambodian mothers. So the education level that's going on in the home is very similar. Among Mexicans, almost half of the fathers have 8 years of education or less. And it's not quite as bad for Cambodians, but it's pretty bad compared to others. But when you look at those from South America, it's a different migration. And from Taiwan, Chinese, it's the absolute opposite. Their parents overwhelmingly have the mother, 2/3 of mothers of Taiwanese immigrants have a college degree themselves. I mean, what does that say about your ability to prepare your children for higher education, right? You've already been there, you know that, you know how to do that. And the poverty levels are substantially different.
And Asian children are not segregated. They tend to be in the very best neighborhoods and schools.
Which, yeah, and I played with doing that. I was putting this together for you guys last night, but we actually looked at where the Asian kids and where the Latino kids and where the African American kids went to school in terms of percentages. We've reported on this and stuff that we've published. And I think it's something like 9% of Latino kids are in the top 20% of performing high schools. 9. Almost half of Asian kids are in those schools. So the schools that you are going to be assigned to are vastly, vastly different in what they're able to do for you.
One way of thinking about this is if you have to come to the US from China or India, you have to have money. You probably have to have education to afford it. Same thing if you come from South America. But if you walk across the border from a village in Mexico, you don't. And most of the middle class in Mexico really isn't interested in immigrating. There's a big, successful middle class in Mexico. Mexico City is full of it.
Yeah, yeah.
They don't, but they're not the immigrants. They're coming here. If they were coming here, they would do very well.
Yeah. So the schools that Latinos attend, few of those schools, thank you, few of those schools have actually provide the rigorous courses that provide you, that prepare you to get into a competitive college or even any college. AP courses, advanced placement courses, international baccalaureate courses, honors courses, simply are not provided. You know, we have schools in the Central Valley of California, I don't think in this particular region, but in the Central Valley and into the Imperial Valley, that don't even provide those A through G courses, all of them, where students have to go someplace else to get the basic course to just graduate prepared to go to a 4-year college, because their high school doesn't offer the full complement of courses. Yeah, it's like hard to believe. It's hard to believe.
California has just about the most stratified higher education system in the United States. Because under the design of California's master plan, only 1/8 of students can possibly get into the University of California. So if you're not in one of the best 20 or 30% of the high schools, your chances of being prepared for the University of California are negligible.
And you're competing against kids who just are living in a different world, literally. Disproportionately, the schools that Latinos attend have underprepared, that is, not fully qualified teachers, and inexperienced teachers, teachers who have only a year or two of experience teaching. And we know that experience matters. I mean, there have been a number of studies that have shown that up to a point, and that's usually somewhere around 10 years or so, up to a point, you get better every year as a teacher. Some of you may have been teachers and may have a very strong sense of this, but you figure out how to do it. But if you are, it's a revolving door of having teachers with 1 or 2 years of experience and they're gone, and then we get new teachers. It's a very different experience for the students. And in these schools, there tend to be very low expectations for the kids. There's a belief that they probably can't do it. They're underprepared. We're not in any position to solve all of their problems of poverty and mobility and, you know, all of this.
The problems is we have very small percentages of teachers who are Latino or African American.
Yeah, I'll mention that in a minute.
Yeah, okay. You've thought of everything.
No, I haven't. No, I haven't. This is really, so we also, in these schools that Latinos attend, we have very high teacher, principal, and student turnover. There's also a lot of research that shows that where you have a continuous kind of experience for kids, it is that is optimal. So that teachers know the kids, they know, oh yeah, I had your brother 3 years ago, and I know the family and this. But when the teachers are constantly changing, nobody knows anybody. Mm-hmm. When the principal is constantly changing, the policies in the schools change overnight, and the teachers become extremely frustrated because, you know, last year I was told to do this, and now this year I'm told to do that, and so what am I supposed to do? And it's one of the things that pushes the teachers out. And there is enormous student turnover because immigrant kids are the most likely in our society to be moving from place to place, so that nobody knows you, nobody has your history, nobody knows what's going on with you. There's also a lot of research that shows that one of the most important ways that kids break out of poverty and break out of low-income circumstances is if they are grouped with peers who do have knowledge about how to do this. Kids learn from their peers, oftentimes more than they learn from their teachers or their counselors, about what options are, where you might go to school, what you need to do in order to get prepared for college. That was the case with me. That was the only way I knew about college, was because of the kids sitting next to me telling me, hey, this is what you got to do. And in this state, being one of the worst in the whole country, we have only one counselor in our schools for every 850 kids. Can you imagine having a caseload of 850? What ends up happening is the only thing those counselors can do is take care of the problems that, you know, are rising immediately with a behavior thing over here, or get you scheduled into a class, and there's no more time in the day. And even if they had more time, which they don't, very few of our counselors are trained in how to get kids into college. In fact, if you ask principals or superintendents of public schools, you ask them, what is your job? They will tell you, my job is to get kids graduated from my district. My job is not to get them into college. That's beyond what I can really be expected to do. So, taking all of those things together, starting out at kindergarten well behind, I haven't even gotten into issues of language, but the children of immigration come to school without speaking English normally, and that's got to be caught up with in some way or other before they can even begin to catch up academically. And all of the other problems, it shouldn't be a big surprise that Latinos are doing so poorly. So the college completion rate, why is that so low? So once we get, you know, that 76% that we get through high school, and then that 29% who actually are able to complete the courses that they need, what's the problem here? Well, we know that there is a big undermatching, due in large part to the lack of information about the benefits of different kinds of colleges. If your parents didn't ever go to high school here, let alone go to college, and you're living in a community that is very segregated and very isolated, it's likely you don't know the difference between going to San Diego City College and going to UCSD. It's all the same. They're both college. Mm-hmm. And so even our students, our Latino students who prepare themselves well, who do exceptionally well, oftentimes end up going to colleges that are less rigorous, less demanding, and offer less to them than they are actually prepared to do. So they end up in community colleges even though they could have gone to a 4-year university. And that matters tremendously. Because if you go to UCSD, if you go to a University of California, you have better than an 80%, about an 85% chance, almost 90% of actually getting your degree. If you go to a 4-year state university like San Diego State, but I won't say that one, San Diego has gotten increasingly competitive, generally speaking, the 4-year, not university, but the 4-year state colleges, you have about a 50-50 chance of actually getting a degree. But if you go to a community college, we've run these data over and over, and they're very controversial, but the best we can figure is you have about a 17% chance of even transferring to a 4-year college if you're a Latino. And that's not saying you're going to get a degree. That's just saying you're going to make it from the 2-year to the 4-year. So your chances of getting a degree are like in the single digits. So it matters hugely where you go, and Latino students tend to go to institutions that are giving them less of a chance to graduate from college than they really need to. But overwhelmingly, they are also underprepared for college, and when they go into the community colleges, that more than 2/3 who didn't even take the courses that they needed to get into a 4-year, that more than 2/3 that will, if they're going to go to college, go to a community college, oftentimes get stuck doing remediation for years until they run out of time, they run out of money, and that's why this chances of getting a degree by starting at community college is in the single digits, because they can't sustain that over the long run.
There's a very strong relationship between what college you choose and how much wealth your family has. So in the United States, incomes are unequal, but wealth is incredibly unequal.
Yeah.
The average Latino family has less than 1/10 the wealth of the average white family.
Gary, can I just ask, by that do you mean that the college you go to predicts how much wealth you will acquire, or how much wealth you have?
How much you have going in.
Both of those things are true.
Yeah, but I think the
wealth
issue here
matters.
is what you
This is a
have.
capitalistic society.
Yeah.
In a very profound way, so is Mexico. And so if you have wealth in terms of owning a home and having a lot of value in that home, you're much more likely to take the risk of signing a loan to pay for your college costs. And a lot of poor families will not do that.
Well, that's what I'm saying here, Gary,
So they end
about
up
sticker
in a-
shock, Gary.
Yeah.
Is that California has one of the best student financial aid programs in the country. And we also provide financial aid for undocumented students. Not all forms, but considerable. But our institutions have become increasingly expensive, and parents look at these figures about what it will cost to go to college, and even with some support from the state, that doesn't take care of your housing costs, your foregone income, that, all the other things that are associated with going to college that you know about. So many parents take a look at that and they say, oh, mijo, that's just not possible. We just can't do that. And so they respond to what we call sticker shock. The other thing that happens is that if you've never known anybody who's gone to college, you don't really know what the benefit of it is. And so this is not a cost-benefit calculus that most parents can make. So they look at the tremendous costs and thinking, ¿y para qué? If you can be out there working now, helping the family, does this really make any sense? And you can't blame them for thinking this, because this is the world in which they live. So many of these young people need to help support their families. And at best, actually, there's a national statistic right now that Latinos go to college at higher rates than white students. So you will hear that. And everybody goes, wow, it's fantastic. We've solved the problem. Latinos are going to college at higher rates than white students by about a percentage or two. But going to college means incredibly different things for the white middle class and what it means for a Latino student. So for the white middle class, that means you went to UCSD, or you went to San Diego State, Or for the Latino student, that means you might have signed up for one class. It's a remedial class at the community college. So these are totally different notions of what it means to go to college. And if you've never known anyone in your community who's gone to college, it's really hard to conceive of why you're going to put in more years and years of study, all of this investment financially, for what?
There's a lot of students who join the military in order to get money for college. But by the time they come out of the military, they're too old and they're too involved and they are wanting to get married and their life is going along and they don't actually go, even though they have quite good benefits for going to college if they've been in the military.
So I just have to say this because I don't really have enough time to get into this. It's a topic I would love to get into with you, and maybe someday I'll be invited back to do that. But I just simply want to make the point that being a Spanish speaker is not a handicap. It should not be a handicap. Any student going to schools anywhere in the US, but especially in California, should not have to suffer as a result of being a Spanish speaker. But the reality is that our schools treat it as a problem and not as an asset, and therefore create a problem for these young people. Just a little heads up, how many of you will be able to vote here in California this next election? Okay, I want all of those of you who will be able to vote to know that on the ballot will be a measure that allows you to decide if we're going to provide more bilingual education in California. That is a response to this. If students are educated bilingually, so they can, of course, everybody needs to learn English in the US, absolutely. But if you can be educated in 2 languages, taught as though you bring an asset to the classroom, these children will do much, much better. We have lots of evidence of that. But California right now has an absurd policy about that. And we would like to change that.
California in the 1980s and 1990s adopted a whole set of anti-civil rights propositions. One of them limited school desegregation. One of them forbade affirmative action in higher education. One of them forbade bilingual education. Another one limited services for immigrant children. And this was all in a period when it was like the Donald Trump of California.
It was like what Arizona is today.
Yes. They were trying to win elections by making people afraid of the changes that are happening in the state. And as of 1998, that ended. And the Republicans who sponsored those measures have lost all the elections since. But those amendments still remain in the California Constitution and are still devastating. And this is the first effort to repeal one of them.
Actually, we don't even use the word repeal.
Well,
To expand opportunities around education, because we don't want people coming down on us and saying that, well, you're just trying to undo what was already voted by the public, right? No, we're trying to expand opportunities for all people so that all children in California could have a bilingual instruction. So I'm just going to tell you a couple of findings from some of our own research that we've done recently that pertain to the issues around the education of Latino students. One is that we find, looking at large data sets, now I'm talking for the most part about big data sets that are collected by the US Department of Education that track on children over time across the grade levels. One of the things that is found, and that we have found in doing this research, is that if students truly believe that they will finish high school, if you ask a student, do you expect to finish high school, you know what, you ask the question in the right way, they actually do finish high school and have a very high likelihood of going on to college. But kids have to believe this is a realistic outcome for themselves, and they have to be made to believe that. So that means everybody's got to be behind this. The teachers have to be telling them, of course you're graduating high school, of course you're going to college, as do the hopefully their family members as well. Math scores in elementary school are early predictors of these kinds of outcomes, of positive outcomes. both in Mexico and in the United States, we have a terrible history of mathematics instruction, and our students do not do particularly well. But upping the math skills of kids early in elementary school has long-term positive outcomes. You don't have to be a math whiz, you just have to be able to do okay. We have seen over time in a lot of studies that many Latinos have a sense of a lack of belonging in school. They don't feel like they belong there. They don't feel invited. They don't feel welcomed. They don't feel like this is a place where they're wanted. There are ways to combat this. One that I think, you know, Gary's not as convinced as I am of this, but I'm so convinced of this, that by incorporating kids into extracurricular activities, you give them a sense of belonging, you give them a positive peer group that supports them. So that means anything you can think of that is not just the regular classroom, but incorporating the kids into mariachi, and incorporating the kids into journalism, into writing newspapers, into doing folklorico, into whatever it is, that they can have a peer group that is associated with something that happens at school and that's fun, that makes you feel like you want to be here, not just the regular thing, creates a sense of belonging for the kids. And it's something we need to be thinking about a whole lot more. I mentioned this before about mainstream students transmit key information in integrated schools. So this is one of the several reasons why I think at the Civil Rights Project we feel very, very strongly about kids being desegregated, getting them out of these isolated, segregated schools where they can have contact with mainstream peers who have some understanding about what the world is beyond this small barrio. We've also found, interestingly, and here's where I report on the statistic, in California, so only about 7.5% of teachers across the country are Latino, even though about 25% of our kids are Latino. But in California, in a certain way, this is almost worse, because I've told you just about 54% of the kids in our schools in California are Latino students, but only 18% of the teachers are Latino. And we have found in national data that the more Latino teachers and or counselors that you have in your life as you're going through school, the greater the likelihood that you are going to go to college. So these teachers who come from the same background, who can kind of relate to the kids and their families, are having an impact if we can get this connection between these teachers and these students. And I can tell you that one reason for this, one of my graduate students a couple years ago did a wonderful study looking at bilingual teachers in Texas, Arizona, and California, comparing them to non-bilingual teachers who were teaching Latino kids. And she found that the bilingual teachers, the ones who actually spoke Spanish, saw as part of their job as teachers to reach out to parents. They just saw that as part of their job. My job is teaching this child and reaching out to the parents so that I can have them as partners. The monolingual teachers, English-only speakers who were teaching these kids, saw it as the parents' job to reach out to them. It's not going to happen, right? And we have found, very importantly, that being biliterate, actually achieving literacy in both English and Spanish, predicts for Latino students going on, not just going to college, as I said before, it can mean signing up for one remedial course, but going to a 4-year college. If you are the child of immigrants and you maintain literacy in both Spanish and English, your chances of going to a 4-year college are significantly higher than if you come from a family and you have lost that language. We could talk about why that is. But okay, so why does all of this matter? Well, there have been some interesting studies done on what happens to economies when you undereducate your population. And one that was done by a national organization that collects data across the country predicted that there would be an 11% decline in the per capita earnings in California. This is for California by the year 2020. That might not sound like that big of a deal until I tell you that the per capita income in California grew by 30% between 1980 and 2000. In other words, the standard of living, the world that we lived in 2000 was the result of 20 years of a 30% growth in income per capita. But what we're looking at is not stopping the growth. We're looking at a decline in those per capita earnings, and that's going to have a significant impact on the economy for all of us. But this is the kind of thing we're talking about for the region. Also, there's been research recently that shows that by the year, within a decade, within 10 years, California is going to be at least 1 million college degrees short of filling the jobs that require a college degree that are being filled now. In other words, those people who hold those positions retire out of them, move on in the life cycle, and the young people coming in are not getting themselves educated to a level where we're going to be sitting here with 1 million jobs we cannot fill with our own homegrown population. One cannot sustain the economy in the Southern California, Northern Mexico region with this.
It's one of the reasons why in the Silicon Valley they bring in hundreds of thousands of people from India and other parts of Asia, because we can't train our own people to do those
Well, we
jobs.
can, we're not doing it.
Well, we're not doing
Right.
it. And that's the greatest technology center in the world. And the jobs are going, many of them, people who are not residents or citizens of either of our countries.
And so we talk a lot about the economy because the economy is important, right? It's jobs, it's how all of us live. But beyond just the economy, there is the whole social fabric, how we live together. And when things become so disparate that we have a few people who can get the good jobs, who live a middle class life, who have access to things, and we have a majority of the people at the bottom who do not have that, it frays the social fabric. So it's not only an economic question, it's a question about the kind of world that we want to live in, the kind of world we want our children to inherit. And is this going to be a place that functions or a place that really doesn't function? And that's it. And so that's why we are so excited to be here with you, to engage in this project that people are going to be talking about for decades.
I would just like to underline the point I started with, which is information, important information on vital subjects can make a difference. It doesn't always make a difference in policy, but to get major reforms, you have to have it. It's one of the necessary preconditions.
Yeah.
And you will be getting information that has never existed. And if you do it well, and it's credible, and it's presented well, it will become a weapon for the people who want to create an understanding of the depths of the problems that we're talking about and the paths out.
Yeah, and who want to resolve those.
Those of us who are working on this will try to make that happen.
Melissa.
I wanted to thank you, Patricia and Gary, both for being with us today. I wanted to make just a couple of points to the class. First, a lot of Patricia and Gary's presentation focused on what's happening in California, because our understanding of what's happening on the other side of the border around these same issues is just a little bit less sophisticated. And so one of the things that we're doing as a broader research team is working on complementing this understanding of California with exactly the same kind of understanding of what happens in Mexico. And the second point is that while you all are going to be really deeply engaged in gathering this data, primarily in Mexican schools, we're going to do it at the same time on this side of the border. And so we'll do an electronic version of the same exact survey that you'll use in Mexico with about half of the schools in San Diego Unified and Sweetwater with a quarter of their classrooms. And so at the end of the day, what we're driving towards is having the same understanding of data on both sides of the border and a new data set that talks about the students that we share back and forth and the student population of the region. And then the other point that I wanted to make was that especially the undergrads in this class have a tremendous amount of insight that many of us as slightly older or older researchers don't have,
Or more than slightly.
You're much closer to these decisions, right? So you know, just 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, we're making these same kinds of decisions yourselves, and we're in the school setting and thinking about the same things that we're asking high school students about now. And I really hope that you can bring that insight to the table when we're going through the data gathering process, because it's something that, you know, maybe Patricia and Gary wouldn't have if they did this without your help.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, students always bring ideas to us. You know, they say, "Whoa, how about that one?" You know, there was a presentation here a couple weeks ago by Claudio X Gonzalez.
They didn't.
They didn't see it because I have that on
Yeah.
my laptop too, and that's the Mexican side of this. Although the data are not as refined because that's what you guys are going to do. You're going to help us build a better understanding of those data.
But we'll share that with everyone. Claudio X Gonzalez runs an organization called Mexicanos Primero, which works with a lot of these same issues. Maybe some people in the room saw his presentation, but
Yeah.
we'll share it with the whole group.
Okay. Yeah, I had that in mind when I was doing this, but of course there's no way to do both. So are there, I think we're at the end of our time, but are there any questions or comments? Comments are always good too. Yeah.
Yo tengo una pregunta.
Sí.
So maybe could you also introduce yourself too, so they can see who you are.
Sí, claro que sí. Mi nombre es Karina Pablo. Soy estudiante de doctorado en UABC.
Ah.
Sí, yo tengo una pregunta. No sé si ustedes hayan estudiado la comunidad asiática, pero no sé qué son qué se puede aprender de ellos porque tienen los porcentajes más elevados o mejores respecto de su educación. Entonces, no sé si haya habido alguna vez una intervención, alguna política, o realmente llegan a California con un nivel económico mayor que les permite incorporarse en
Bueno, eso es cierto,
escuelas.
sí.
No sé, porque de pronto también cuando estás en una universidad como esta, pues encuentras muchas personas con esa ascendencia, ¿no? Con ese rasgo étnico. Entonces quisiera saber si se han hecho estudios para saber qué es lo que han hecho ellos o cómo como comunidad les permite llegar a esas.
Sabes, hace varios años, hace 30 años o más, hubo un estudio por un señor ya muy destacado de la Universidad de Texas, Spanglish. Uri Treisman is a professor at the University of Texas, and at the time he was at Berkeley, and he was developing a mathematics program trying to help students who were coming into Berkeley, students of color, minority students coming in who were not doing as well in math. And so since the Asian students did so well, Uri wanted to see what was it that they did that seemed to, aside from coming from situations that were, you know, better off economically, what was it that students did that seemed to make a big difference? And he noted that the Asian students studied together collaboratively. They would study in small groups and help each other, and if they, you know, one didn't know how to do a problem, the other one would help them solve it. And he noted, in this case, he was looking particularly at African American students, and noticed that they were all studying independently, all by themselves, with nobody to help, nobody to particularly turn to. And so Uri, over the years, over decades now, has created this really very effective mathematics projects or programs. And they're all based on this collaborative learning method, where the students are taught to learn together, to collaborate, and to figure out problems together. And he's shown some really significant improvements for the other students. Now, Latino students are oftentimes viewed as being very collaborative. They prefer to study in groups rather than to study independently, but that's not been necessarily fostered in the schools. And so that certainly is one area where I think we could do a whole lot better on building on another asset that Latino students bring, but that is not exploited, that's not supported or fostered.
You know, in parts of Asia, like China, Japan, Korea, all of the life of young people is built around passing tests to get into college.
Yeah.
it's incredibly intense. People don't go to cram schools all the time in addition to regular schools. And one of the things Asian communities do is have Saturday schools, and night schools, and special tutoring, and all kinds of things like that. It's you know, China has been an exam-driven society for 1,000 years. So that's a difference. But I think the largest difference is that they are a very selective immigration.
Yeah.
It's probably the most selective immigration in American history. So it's like the Cubans who came to Miami in the first wave, a very highly educated group with capital and with organizational skills, and they have flourished. And people who come to the U.S. economy now with those kinds of resources and find a way to move into the areas with the most powerful public schools, they flourish. People who don't and who move into areas that have the worst schools and don't get enough jobs, don't get high enough income to give them their families any chance and so forth, you know, they get into a downward spiral.
You know, Alejandro Portes he's at Princeton now, but he did some really interesting research too that I would have you guys take a look at, and segmented assimilation. And what Alejandro shows is that if you come, let's say that you are an Asian student and you're poor, your family does not have the kind of income that is the average for the Asian immigration. But if you integrate into a community that has resources, your kids are going to do a whole lot better. They're going to be able to take advantage of the community resources and the kind of things that are brought to the community. But for most Latino kids, not unlike the Cuban migration, most Latino kids are integrating into a downward spiral of communities that are becoming more and more impoverished. And so they don't have these resources to tap into. And so it's very sociological.
But you know, there's a lot of things that can be done about this. For example, we try to encourage the creation of more magnet schools. We try to see to it that choice programs in school systems are run so that poor kids and their families get a reasonable chance at the really good schools. There's a lot of policy levers that one could think about that would make better opportunities available. But you know, to actually make those things move, we need to have information to convince people with about why they're necessary. If you think that the problem is that these kids and their families are lazy and don't care like others do, then you don't think anything needs to be done. But if you know that they do care, but they face enormous barriers, and that when they're given a chance, they achieve much more than anybody would expect, then it's a different discussion. But to make that discussion happen, you have to have good data.
Right, a little bit about what you just said. I found consistency between the percentage of Latino who get into higher education here and Mexicans who get into higher education in Mexico. So institutional arrangements are different and they're getting the same rate of, very similar rate of
Because they have social capital at the very least. Yeah, por lo menos, yeah.
Hi. For me, it was really interesting observation for the presentation, looking at who's getting education and sort of the reasons behind it, right? So a lot of times we hear about undocumented immigrants are taking the jobs, the well-paying jobs, and the resources.
You know, I address some of that right here in this first chapter. This is like puras mentiras.
And when you laid it out, right, to also see the African American community and how these jobs are being, taken away, unions are being weakened, jobs are being exported to other countries, right? So you start seeing who is really benefiting. It's that 1% corporations who then benefit from low-wage workers who can be exploitable and be taken advantage of. My question was in regards to, so I'm from Chicago, and what we have right now is an epidemic on for-profit colleges. These colleges that are coming in, targeting African American and Latino students with these, get your degree 1 year, extremely expensive, some of which sometimes come out and they're not even accredited.
Right.
Are you seeing that affect the impact in California, or is this different here?
No, it's not different. It's not as big, but it's growing, and it is a tremendous problem because, as I was saying before, that most of these kids and these families don't know the difference between going to Heald College and going to the University of California. They just don't know the difference, and they're targeted, right, with this kind of, in a year, you know, this other thing, you're looking at all this money in 4 or 5 years or something, but in a year we can give you the credentials to get this great job, and they don't know how to make those distinctions.
Well, this is one area where the Obama administration is actually doing something.
Yeah.
They are shutting down the most fraudulent private colleges. The Corinthian system was shut down this year, which is a huge system here in California. And they're going after other ones because basically the students who go to the Phoenixes and the Corinthians and those places, they are encouraged to take out maximum loans.
Yeah.
And very few graduate. And those who graduate do not get treated in the job market like people who have degrees from regular high quality
Accredited
colleges.
places.
So they can't pay their loans, so they go bankrupt. Then the government loses a lot of money because the loans don't get paid back. So they are going after those schools now, which is very overdue because about 1/4 of all the student aid in the country was going to those schools, which are entirely dependent on federal student aid, and students are borrowing money that they will never be able to pay back in those schools.
I think one reason why it hasn't been as big of a problem, it is a problem
Yeah.
here, but not as big, is because we have such a huge community college. You know, 100 and how many do we have? 120 community colleges in California that compete with those places.
But we did notice when we visited different community colleges that in their counseling offices, they have computers supplied by the Phoenix College, which leads the kids directly into those schools.
Oh, we totally freaked out. We went
Yeah.
in one community college, they wanted us to go look at this great center they had to help the students transfer on. And this was the place that was mostly Latino students too. So we go into the counseling center where they have this big bank of computers, and all of them have the screensaver for this for-profit college, right? So when you sit down to it as a student, the first thing you see is an advertisement for the for-profit college. And it's like it never occurred to them that this might be a problem.
But this is one place where data is beginning to really make a difference. And I think more and more of these schools are going to be shut down, but because as soon as the federal government stops giving loan money to them, they go bankrupt. They don't have any other source of income.
Christina, did you have a question as well?
Yeah, I do. I don't know if we have enough time, but I guess I'm not too familiar with the education system in general, but I guess just from my own experience and from what you had talked about in your presentation, it seems like part of the issue is almost psychological, that we need to have the teachers, you know, convey to all of the students that I believe that you're going to, like, it's expected that you're going to a four-year university and you're graduating from that four-year university. So I was just curious, you know, from your experience, how do you think we can address these issues? And if we, you know, do find ways of addressing them, how long is that going to take? And, you know, I guess just logistical issues like that.
There's whole movements around raise the expectations. There's whole professional development programs that go into schools around teachers raising their expectations for students. But our schools are in trouble. And, it's one thing to raise expectations, it's another thing to actually provide the kinds of things that kids need in order to be successful. And so I think it's really, first it's hard psychologically to change people's ideas, their view of the world, which is that certain people are, all of this sort of stuff about hidden bias and that, it's really true. We all have a certain schema, we all have a certain idea that we bring to any situation in which we see some people as being successful and others as not. And, anyway. I'm not going to go into more detail about that, but I think you know what I mean. So it's hard to change teachers' opinions. And that's one reason why we need more teachers from the communities that these children come from, because if you come from a community that has been middle class, which most teachers do, that has been part of the mainstream, it's really hard to understand the kinds of barriers that would cause a child not to be prepared or not to feel like they're going to college. And so teachers from the mainstream tend to have a certain set of beliefs that, well, you know, these kids don't expect to do that, and I don't expect them to do it either. So it's really hard to change that. But it's particularly hard when you're in a school that has got all kinds of problems. And these are the schools that we send the bulk of our Latino students to. These are schools that are just rife with problems of behavior, because poverty engenders lots of problems.
We really have to think about much more powerful ways to communicate with those students and parents who have no experience with higher education. And I've often thought about it. You know, we should go into schools and say, if you ever want to buy a new car, if you ever want to have a home, if you ever want anybody to marry you, you better get through this level of education, because otherwise your chances are very small of any of those things. You know, we really need to think about, to tell the parents, we see that your student hasn't taken geometry and he's in his 3rd year in high school. Please sign this paper that says you don't want him to have to go to college or to have an opportunity, because he can't if he doesn't take these courses.
Yeah.
You know, we need to communicate much more powerfully to people, because people who are educated already know these things.
Now, there is a program that comes right out of here in San Diego called PIQUE,
Yeah, wonderful
the
program.
Parent Institute for Quality Education. I love these people because I think they've got it. They've figured it out. They really direct this towards immigrant parents. They do everything in Spanish, and they train parents to be the leaders in these programs. And one of the very impressive things that they do, they have 9 sessions which they train parents how to advocate for their kids. This is the primary thing. How do you advocate? You have to have all this information to know what the school needs to be providing, and this is how you advocate for your child. But they've been doing this for, I don't know, 35, 40 years, and they've got it down. So on the very first day when the parents come to this, they put up on the board a bunch of circles and say, okay, what's your son's name? Okay, Juan. What's your daughter's name? Vanessa. Okay, and they fill in all of these circles with the names of the kids whose parents are there in the room. And then they say, how many of you don't want your child to go on to college? Nobody raises their hand. Then they take an eraser, erasing all those names, Juan, Karina, and so on, just erasing them off the board, which is powerful for the parents because they're seeing their kid's name disappearing from the board. And they say, this is the reality. These children are not going to college unless we do what we're going to do in this group. And it's a parent talking to another parent. It takes their breath away. And so there are some programs that are trying to do this. And the thing is, if the parents know how to advocate for their kids, they can push on the system. They can push on the teachers. My child is going to college. I need these things for my child. These are the expectations we have in our home for our son or daughter. I think we have to wait.
You know, let me tell you one story. I had a student whose parents were farm workers in Southern California, and it was when I was teaching at Harvard. And he was a student there, an undergraduate. And he said, you'll never guess how I got to Harvard. My parents were field workers, and they had only 3rd grade education. And I said, how did you do it? And he said, when they would ask me at school, what am I going to do? I always said, I'm going to Harvard. And he didn't know what it was. But they said, well, if you're going to go to Harvard, you have to take this course. You have to do this, you have to do that. And he did all those things, and he went to Harvard. But, you know, we have to treat these students who are smart and want to do something in a way that takes their aspirations seriously, and say, if you really want to do that, you better be in the honors class by 3rd or 4th grade. You better do this, you better do that, because that's the path. There is a path, and people know what it is, but they don't look at those kids and think that they want to be on it, or that they're capable, or that they're motivated to do it.
So thank you guys. This was a pleasure to be with you. We look forward to being with you this week. We'll all have a reunion in 10 years, right? When we're talking about all the books that have been published out of this.
So we typically take a break now. Patricia and Gary, do you have a few minutes to linger, or do you need to hit the road in case folks want to come up and ask you something privately?
5 minutos.
Okay, so 5 minutes to swarm our guests, and then if everybody could be back here in 10, please, because we still have a lot to get through today. Thank you very much.
¿Qué pasó? Hola. Sí, lo tengo.
Leí la explicación, no le hice nada porque pero estaba pensando que le copiaste exactamente
Y sin los comentarios, sí, la cosa exactamente.
que lea
Sí, exactamente, sí, no se han modificado. Sí, y lo venía pensando antes que no para modificarlo. Sí. Exactamente. ¿Algo más? ¿Qué piensas? De la... Sí. Sí. No pegaban.
y cambié el orden porque o sea,
¿Empezaba como demográfico o el orden de las preguntas?
más en el sentido de hacer todo lo demás más al principio y luego para que no fuera como una mezcla de una pregunta sobre su familia y luego una pregunta sobre cuántas horas estudia cambié un poco el sentido de algunas porque yo quiero que
Sí, es
que nada
eso, y algunos preámbulos que eran como justamente lo que había comentado Lea en las clases, no sesgar la respuesta. Unos preámbulos en las preguntas en la comunidad, en la identidad, pensamos que es un preámbulo para
para que tuviera tendencia a contestar cierta creo que había una así porque el maestro también le iba a poner como de alguna manera en la que
no, sí, está bien, muchas gracias. Yo ahorita reviso pero no, a mí me parece esa planeta muy sustancioso.
son 22 preguntas nada más como o sea, creo que nos tenemos que especificar si va a ser porque no entendí bien las instrucciones pero especifica que iba a ser Edna Survey y ya nada más.
Bueno. Hola, ¿cómo estás? Gracias. Ya Itzel lo hizo. Bueno, hizo el formato. Y ya solo falta recuperar lo que para la hipótesis lo que ella comentó. Solo se puso pie de hipótesis para nada más sería eso y ya lo mandamos. Yo creo que la presentación sí. No sé qué tengamos pendiente.
¿No nos han dado?
Creo que no. Yo no he revisado. Pero está muy bien.
No sé si tengamos que darle como una versión revisada de lo pasado.
No, yo creo que sí.
Tenemos que corregir eso.
Sí. Bring down the... Sí, está. No, eso ya lo teníamos.
¿Cuántos tienen que trabajar sobre eso?
Sí, eso ya. ¿Cómo nos
We're
organizamos?
really on a lot of, they were, it's always for all the.
Todos tienen todas las diamas, ¿no?
Because they were always plotting things and.
Tengo que ir a firmar algo, si
Ve.
quieres hablamos al final de
Sí,
la clase.
ve. Ok. Yo lo voy a ver ahora.
Ojalá. So, Max, solo quiero que sepas que en tu caso no es normal.
No.
Okay? No es normal y
Well,
nunca nos ha pasado.
Yeah.
Okay?
And what I said to them wasn't normal either, but it was necessary.
I wanted to, but then I got called into work.
Okay. Porque nosotros tenemos un grupo increíble.
He is going to adjust or we'll get.
What's the hours? I wanted to go because